Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz is in China, speaking with its leaders at a time when economic and diplomatic relations between the EU and Beijing are increasingly strained. Following a meeting between Scholz and Chinese Premier Qiang, Li said that the economic interests of both countries remain deeply intertwined. President Xi Jinping warned Scholz against resorting to protectionist economic measures, saying the two countries depend on free trade. Last year, Germany launched a strategy to avoid over-dependence on China. Scholz's visit has been overshadowed by Iran's attack on Israel over the weekend. Just minutes ago, he spoke to reporters and reiterated global calls for restraint from both sides. Let's hear what he had to say.
The question regarding the attack of Iran on Israel, well, for me, it is obvious because it was an unprecedented attack that is completely unjustified, an unprecedented escalation that gives rise to concern, and now it is about everybody contributing to not increasing this escalation anymore. And I have made clear that it's not only about the Israeli forces, but a broad understanding in the region that this is not acceptable, and I am convinced that this has been taken on board.
DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, is with me here in the studio. Richard, the war in Gaza, not the only conflict on the Chancellor's mind. Ukraine was everywhere and top of the agenda. Did he get what he wanted from the Chinese? Concessions regarding their support for Russia?
Yeah, so, I mean, Olaf Scholz went to China with a message which he's been kind of calibrating on Ukraine and kind of putting front and center this time this point that not just the invasion of Ukraine is a breach of the UN Charter, that it's aggression against Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, the kind of argument that we've heard for a long time from Europeans and Western powers supporting Ukraine, but also saying that this is the core interests of the Europeans and the Germans, that there's this war raging, it's a threat to European security, and China is supporting Russia diplomatically, economically, in the provision of so-called dual-use goods, so not necessarily weapons, but the kind of goods that can help in its war efforts. And saying that, you know, what China is doing is hurting our interests directly. And I think this is an attempt to kind of adopt the language that China will often use about when it perceives threats to its own core interests, you know, discussions about Taiwan, for instance. So he's really trying to hammer home to the Chinese that what you are doing really affects us, really hurts us. Whether he really got any movement from the Chinese, though, on this is really quite questionable. There's been a lot of talk about a peace conference that is to be held in Switzerland this summer. The Germans were hoping that the Chinese would say that they would go to this. This is the third in a round of peace conferences. A Chinese delegate went to the first one, but did not go to the second one. So the hope has been, OK, let's get the Chinese back to the table. They're so important. What the Chinese seem to be saying from their readouts from these meetings is that, well, we might go to it if it also includes the Russians. And so far, the Russians have not been involved. So all that they've really agreed to do is to stay in close contact on that question. Now, I think Scholz was saying to reporters just earlier, well, the fact that we're moving on to talking about these potential processes is in itself a good thing, and that, alongside the military support for Ukraine, is an important part of our strategy. But still, nothing really that tangible, and I think we'll have to see in the weeks ahead whether some sort of tangible progress is made towards making that conference in the summer in Switzerland meaningful. Yeah,
that was the first visit by the German Chancellor to China since the launch of the de-risking strategy. Yeah. Now, China would like to see Germany as an important trading partner for China, kind of rein in what it sees as European protectionism, especially with, you know, a looming trade war, as many perceive it, coming out of Brussels. Is Germany going to do China that favor?
Yeah, so, I mean, Germany's in a tough spot on China, and we've seen it kind of wrestling with this for a few years now. It came out with a strategy last year where, you're right, it used this term de-risking, the idea of, like, let's try to reduce the risk of certain entanglements in the relationship. the risk of being too dependent on China as a source of particular raw materials that you need in high-tech products, for instance. De-risking is a term that's been used in Europe. It came first from Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, who said that this has got to be the core of our strategy, and the US has now embraced this too. The trouble is, a lot of people have a different interpretation of what de-risking means. So for some people, it's really all about those raw materials and making sure you're not too dependent on those. For others, it's like, don't be too exposed to the Chinese market. Like, what if you are a Mercedes or a Volkswagen or a BMW? China accounts for a huge percentage of your sales. Then China suddenly goes and invades Taiwan. What happens to your market there? You know, do you still have that access? And Olaf Scholz is very cautious about trying to tell German companies what to do. And in fact, he took the bosses of a lot of those companies along with him to China. And those big companies have invested last year more than they'd ever invested before in China. So there's a real sense that not everyone is on the same page. Now, on top of all this, you mentioned this, the European Commission is doing investigations now into whether China is unfairly supporting its electric vehicle industry, its wind turbine industry, all sorts of industries that are now exporting into the European market and also other global markets, and that these goods are unfair competition to European manufacturers of, say, cars. The European Commission is doing an investigation. This could yield some sort of measures against these Chinese products. But German car companies are worried about this. They're saying, oh no, like if you impose like tariffs or something on Chinese cars, what if the Chinese do this to us? Then we lose the Chinese market. So there's a worry in Europe that Germany might try to kind of undermine these European investigations in its talks with China. Olaf Scholz used this term pragmatism when he was talking to the press just earlier. This should guide our policy towards this pragmatism. There's going to be a lot of like picking apart. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that, you know, maybe this European investigation is not pragmatically motivated? Is it ideological or something like that? We don't know yet. We're going to have to kind of read between the lines and try to pick this apart in further context with the German government. But I think there'll be a lot of people in Brussels watching what he just said very closely.
That was our chief international editor, Richard Walker. Thank you so much for breaking it all down for us.